Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great webinar on tap with some really interesting information, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. Today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will be able to access it on demand. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if you have a question for either of our panelists at any time during today's presentation, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your question. We'll try to get to as many audience questions as we can near the end of today's presentation. Okay, with that, we'll go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is Getting to Cloud 9. Container, Cloud, and Serverless Migration Strategies. Our speakers today are John Willis, who is the founder of Bachagaloop and co-author of the DevOps Handbook, and Anders Wallgren, who is CTO at Electric Cloud. Welcome, gentlemen. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here. So we're going to do this as kind of a conversational thing. We've got a bunch of slides to kind of structure this around, but hopefully this will be mostly, kind of John and I bouncing back and forth on, saying interesting, clever, and smart things mostly. So if we go to the next slide here, kind of, what do people want to know? How do we maximize our ROI with cloud migration? There's lots of things you can do in terms of getting into the cloud, but then the question then becomes, how do you actually take advantage of the fact that you're now in the cloud? So there's a little bit of work to be done around that. Talking about ways to make that cloud migration as smooth as possible. And I'll also talk about why full visibility of the infrastructure before, during, and after that migration is pretty important and vital. And I'm gonna kick it off just kind of with one thing that I like to talk about here, which is, and I'll get John's input on this as well, of course. But just because cloud is a hammer doesn't mean everything is a nail. And kind of what I mean by that is over the last few years, everybody's had to have a, and I'm using air quotes here, a cloud strategy. How are we going to move into the cloud? How are we going to make it cheap? How are we going to, make it run better? How are we going to, scale infinitely and make everybody happy and all of those kinds of things? And that's, that's all well and good. But there are also some realities in terms of what you have to do in order to take advantage of that. And that's some of the things that I want to kind of get into in the early parts here. So if we go to the next slide, just kind of want to talk a little bit about application architecture, because that has a big impact on how easily and smoothly you can, in the first place, migrate an application into a cloud provider, whether you're going, into VMs or going into, Docker containers and Kubernetes, or, going all the way to sort of serverless and Lambda and all of these kinds of things. And the reason I put this little phrase on here, how the Fibonacci paradigm applies, that's sort of my little curmudgeonly way of saying that all the examples that you see out there of, here's serverless and here's Lambda, they're all easy, dirt simple, and uninteresting examples. They're like, here's how you can use serverless to implement the Fibonacci algorithm, which not a lot of us need to do, and doesn't involve any of the interesting problems that we need to solve, like persistence and security and all of those kinds of things. So the point really here, and kind of the discussion point that I want to have with you, John, is, where does application architecture fit into this? Can you take any application? Can I take my decades old monolithic application and kind of dump it into the cloud? Is that something I want to do? Is that smart? Is that dumb? All of those kinds of questions. So I'll just leave that as a very open-ended kind of opening for you there, John, to chime in.
Yeah, no, and I love your quote. It's the whole hammer nail thing, right? We tend to be so myopic and just in life, but it's certainly in IT. We get onto something. I mean, there's we can save this one, but there's like a growing DevOps versus serverless conversation going on, right? Like, it's so ridiculous, right? Like, and we can circle back to that. But I think in kind of my response to your opening analysis of where we are architecturally, I think you raised some great points, and I think the answer is sort of all of the above, in that I think there's there's some interesting things, back in the early days of cloud, like 2011, 2012, there was a lot of this forklifting of old legacy, Java-like, but legacy Java applications that are running on, $1 million distributed machines, like very expensive Sun gear or HP gear or IBM gear. And people would just take that and forklift it over to kind of Amazon EC2 instances. And, back in the early days of Amazon, the whole design was commodity infrastructure, scalable commodity infrastructure. So you didn't get that kind of classic RAS, reliability, availability, and serviceability. It wasn't built in. It wasn't by design. So just a error check in your program that ran on a $500,000 Sunbox, like, just blew up the whole application when you moved it over. So we learned our lesson, and we kind of moved down the road, and we started understanding what kind of applications are more malleable to kind of move to the cloud, right? We started talking about kind of decoupling, and now I think we talk about cloud native, and I think it's the right conversation. So you have that, right? So there's been like a 10-year lessons learned, if I want to keep it in boundaries of 10 years, of what not to do, what to do, and then and then containers come along, and that sort of stretches a little bit, because in one sense it's still a true ideal that you want to get kind of and I do think, I kind of fought the cloud native idea for a while, but I do think it's the right way to think about architecture today. So you have the kind of cloud native, which fits perfectly with a containerized world, or clustered containers. But then on the left hand, there's been a redesign. I don't know that it's a great thing, but this kind of lift and shift, or kind of transformation idea that you can take old legacy apps, containerize them, rip them off of their old operating systems, and then move those containers kind of decoupled, with really not changing, in some cases nothing, but some cases just padding in some libraries in a container and running them. So there is actually a little bit of leeway in something that was seemingly taboo, if I'm making sense, which is you never wanted to take old legacy applications without kind of refactoring them and moving them into the cloud. And then containers come along, and it's a perfect marriage for newly decoupled, just call it cloud native design applications. But there's a little bit of an opening here where some of the some of the big vendors, Microsoft definitely, you have seen an opportunity to move, like, old 2008, 2013 server workloads onto kind of 2016, because they basically lift and shift it into a container. So the thing is, it's kind of the same old story with a couple of new chapters.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing I've seen quite a few times is, you take your 15 gigabyte WAR file that you run in WebSphere or WebLogic or something like that, and you run it in a container, which is great. If you can get that to work, and lots of people do, that's fantastic. But now you're, are you ideally positioned at that point to take advantage of containers and take advantage of what you can do with containers? And there, I'm a little bit muddier on that in terms of, what have you really given yourself at that point?
And I think that's the whole question is also, why are you going to the cloud, right? Like, are we following the leader? And so it again opens up a couple of questions, right? I think, or let me finish this thread. I think, people who are really thinking about this clearly, the answer to that question you just raised, why do you take like a monster Java file and just forklift it into a container and run it in a container in the cloud? I think the only correct answer is because you have a deprecated operating system, or there's some coupling to a completely deficient way of running, that application. And so in that case, you take the lesser of two evils. You do the lift and shift. Otherwise, then you actually start an aggressive, transformation opportunity to start decoupling and start, basically thinking about, buzzword bingo, microservices, but certainly cloud native by design application, restructuring. And again, I think you do it in sort of a stranglehold pattern. You rip the outside pieces out first, and you work your way in.
Yeah, and then in that sense, the forklifting is really the beginning of the process, not the goal in and of itself. Although I think a lot of people assume that is the goal, and then a little bit.
That's where I get a little bit like, you know, I step back now, and you know, I know this is Cloud9, how to get to the cloud, but like, the one thing I go into organizations and I see them like have, you know, like a cloud operations group, and they want to hire some, you know, some big shot person to be the director or the VP of the cloud operations, and they're still, even on their best day, they're less than, you know, 12% even, you know, into this year be migrated to the cloud. And then you ask about like, what about all the other stuff? Oh, you know, that's legacy. We don't worry about that. So like it's completely the wrong mindset. You know, I'm a firm believer that, you know, most of the so if you're not doing the forklift, the lift and shift, or you're doing lift and shift for things that you want to get off because of really kind of nasty costs, or again, old legacy operating systems that you want to divorce yourself from. And if that's the case, then the right way to think about this is not go to cloud in terms of Amazon, Google, or Azure. It's start thinking about how do you migrate your workloads to cloud native, which by definition now, the prime the prime pattern of that is containers. So what you start doing first is start architecting, designing for a clustered container-based world. You know, today we would say that's Kubernetes and containers, and variants of containers, Docker only being one, by the way. Not, you know, don't get me started about everybody just calls it Docker, and there's a lot of variants that aren't the commercial company Docker that are being used. And so, you know, in that case, then what you really should be focusing on is the operationalization of containers in clustered environments, and then you get something beautiful for free, which is it doesn't matter where you run it. So now you've built your, you know, I use the cell phones in Russia. I mean, why do you have to go to landlines to get the cell phones? You don't, right? You know, or China or wherever. But the point is, start designing your cloud native world. Stop living in this fantasy of going out and building out your, you know, operations management teams for cloud, hiring directors and all these cloud specialists at the expense of the 90s, you know, the 88% that you're still running in the infrastructure behind the firewall. Right?
Yeah, exactly. And that really kind of summarizes, you know, the entire point of, you know, kind of this part of the conversation very nicely in terms of application architecture matters, you know, and if you want to move that 88%, you know, that's where you got to focus some of your efforts, not necessarily on, you know, how do you make the 12% run as well as possible? Not that that's a bad idea to do, but, you know, if in a world of limited resources, you definitely want to pay attention to everything else as well.
And the other thing too is, you know, the thing cloud is just it's a manifestation of compute. You know, just like VMs or EC2, you know, cloud instances, or running on GCP or running on serverless, which we'll get into. These are just manifestations of compute. We tend to think of got to get to cloud. What you're really saying is I've got to go to color orange instead of blue. I mean, you know, it's not that dramatic, but and you know, and of course we both know there are architectural opportunities going from, you know, VMware to, you know, EC2 to containers. But at the end of the day, what we're really just talking about is a compute instance. And I think we built strategies around these target endpoint compute instances, and not strategies about how we want to like think about an architecture that, you know, that basically, you know, spans across all these.
Yeah, I mean, there used to be bumper stickers a few years ago. I haven't seen anyone recently, but, you know, cloud, other people's computers. You know, and that's really in a sense what it is. I mean, it's just, you know, it's a data center with compute, and you're using it. And yeah, there are different ways to do it, and they're definitely more software defined than in the old days. But in the end, it's your application and the functionality and value it provides to your customers that are going to provide, you know, the money, love, respect, or whatever it is that you're looking to get out of that from your customers and your community. And the fact that it's running in the cloud or not is really irrelevant. you know?
Yeah, and the only kind of sidebar relevance, which is relevant if somebody's screaming right now, listening, saying, what about rack and stack? Yeah, of course. You know, there are very few reasons for a large corporation that makes blue widgets to rack and stack their own computers, right? So when I say that it's just a compute instance, I'm making the base assumption, even if you are going to run behind the firewall with clustered container structures, I'm just going to call it containers and Kubernetes from here on. And then like there are large service providers that really, you know, are other people's computers. You know, I mean, they may be yours, but they run, you know, like, you know, a Switch, a SuperNAP, or some monster places where actually you don't really have to do anything about racks and you know, HVACs and power and all that stuff, right? I mean, like, you know, there's very limited rationale for actually having to run your own kind of racks, other than like you're stuck with them and you're waiting for your you know, the kind of your tax burdens to roll over, if you will, the operation, the OPEX.
Yep. I mean, it's really a question of, you know, raising the level of abstraction at which you can operate, you know, where we don't have to worry about that, the physical aspect of the compute, the electric.
You nailed it, right? That's the point. That is the only point. It isn't about cloud. It isn't about serverless. It isn't about containers versus Docker versus Knative versus Lambda, right? Again, which we'll get into. It's about what you just said. It's about raising abstraction. In fact, I'll let you say it over again because you said it way better than I can.
Yeah, I mean, it is. Yeah, I'll say it again because you asked me to. But yes, it's raising the level of abstraction to where you don't have to worry about the details of this, you know? Right. You don't have to worry about how many amps are coming into the data center. You don't have to worry about how many BTUs you've got to you know, extricate from the data center, and, you know, how big your diesel tank is and how many generators you have, and, you know, all of that crap, which, you know, 15, 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, you know, those were things that we had to worry about if we wanted to, you know, provide a service and some value to our customers. And today, that's as a service, you know, and as a service to me is abstraction. That's really what it comes down to.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Well said.
So if we move on to kind of the next topic here, and you know, I've kind of given it the umbrella term of, you know, continuous delivery. But really fundamentally, one of the biggest things that I see, and I think you know, there's obviously, as with so many of these things, there are many definitions of these things, but, you know, continuous delivery in terms of continuous integration, continuous testing, continuous, you know, deployment release, you know, however you want to phrase those things. The one thing that I still see so many of us getting stuck on there is what I'm raising here as an issue, which is testing. There is still a massive amount of manual testing going on in the industry, and even to the extent where, you know, people will say, oh yeah, our testing is automated. What they mean by that is, after they spent a day in a meeting in an architecture committee to ask for an environment to be stood up, and then they wait a couple of days for that environment to be stood up, then they ask another team to deploy the software onto that environment that they waited a few days to get stood up, and then they can push play on their automated test, you know, product to run the tests. So this is one of those things where we think we're way more automated and orchestrated than we, you know, actually are. And so I want to talk about, you know, just kind of the idea of continuous delivery, and what does that mean when there are all these sort of discrete manual handoffs that we have to do in order to get to these things. And, you know, kind of the relevant question here is, how does this hurt or help, or you know, is it indifferent to the amount of success that we can have in running these things in the cloud? And in particular, you know, the testing thing is the one that I see people get stuck on all the time. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you know, I think must be another book out there that me and you are not reading, because the book that I read was just Humble and Farley's, you know, Continuous Delivery, and it was pretty clear. And I think me and you also are a little bit lucky, is that we kind of grew up in the software business. You know, my baptism to continuous delivery was when I was like working at Chef, you know, starting in like 2009, right? And like it was absolutely clear that to do this, you had to have some high level of code coverage. Like it was like unquestionable in the early days of preaching these ideas. Like you would, you know, there were two things that were really, really important, and that was a collaborative nature of, you know, of like, if you were going to do this, like you're going to have a break to build and you're going to have everybody deliver from trunk, a single trunk, right, and all that. There were two things that you had to get right or don't bother. And one was a collaborative nature, right, like where, and I'll go back to that. But then the other was, was like almost, it was table stakes, which is, basically you had to have test coverage because it just was kind of, the concept just broke down completely. So you're right. I mean, you walk into large companies today and they talk about like, doing DevOps or, have, built these automated pipelines or whatever. And then you ask about testing and like, yeah, no, we're having a hard time getting our developers to do that. And like, okay, like how does that work? Because I don't even see, like to me, like, being sort of raised on again, there are variants. People find ways to create productivity, and I try not to question something that works. But in general, I think, I've always thought and sort of was raised on the concept that the high levels of test coverage was just a fundamental primitive to be able to do continuous delivery.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's obviously a lot easier, as all of these things are, or at least most of them are, if you're starting with a greenfield application. You've got a blank slate, you've got a clean sheet of paper, and you're going to architect something out. But the difficult thing is if you've got an operational application that's been around for a while. Maybe it's monolithic or maybe it's not. That doesn't really matter. But if your path to production involves handoffs and meetings and manual testing and and all of these things, the little light bulb that goes off over my head every time I use these phrases are opportunity for error, opportunity for error, opportunity for error. That's really something to pay attention to and to be aware of, because you can have the most wonderful application and the most wonderful strategy for how to get that thing into the cloud, but if then you're only updating it once a year or even once a month or what have you, then you're not really on that sort of happy path to where you can really react to the market. You get feedback from your customers, but if it takes you a year to implement it and then get it out, and often what we've seen, just to kind of give a more concrete example, we've seen examples where customers will implement a piece of functionality or fix a problem or something in 15 minutes. And then it takes 90 days to get it into production. Yeah, no, and it's not 90 days of like heavy continuous activity.
Right.
It's days of sitting around, meeting, those kinds of things. And that's, I think, where a lot of the value is being lost.
Yeah, again, I think there's two things. One is, calling it continuous delivery. I go back to, it was almost 2006, and it was really the first presentation that I ever saw. Granted, I didn't see it until like 2008, not in 2006, but was, Humble, Chris Reed, and Dan North gave a presentation, and it's got, it's basically the famous Wikipedia slide, which is, it shows this whole continuous delivery pipeline, and it's like green, green, red, go back, green, 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 red, go back, green, 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 red, go back, right? Like, and that is, I still use that picture in some of my decks and slides today, and people are like, ooh, taking pictures of it. I'm like, by the way, this was presented in 2006. But the whole point of that slide, which was that, that idea that those reds were gates, right? And without the gates, like the feedback, the instant feedback, they're basically kind of churning, the iterating really fast, finding out fast feedback, fixing fast, turning it around. That was really sort of, again, it's confusing to me that when you walk into an environment and they talk about DevOps teams and they talk about using, Azure DevOps and how wonderful it is. And again, nothing against your DevOps, nothing against any, technology, but, and then you start finding out that, it's kind of a sort of a waterfall, like the final piece sits somewhere and then an operationalized team has to take it. And well, that's kind of pre-DevOps. And then, this idea that we really haven't gotten the testing thing, and I get one more comment about testing too. There's times when I've gotten into it with clients and then they kind of sheepishly sometimes say, and these are shops that do heavy Java development, and they say, you know, quite frankly, I'm embarrassed to ask, but can you teach us test-driven development? And normally I bring somebody else in. I mean, I know TDD, but I'm not a developer, right? So I have people that I use for that. But it's almost like sometimes they're sort of ashamed. It's like the weird, like these enterprises, like, yeah, we've got, you know, 400 Java developers, and like, and then well, you know, I guess I have to raise my hand now. Hey, John, you know, we don't really know test-driven development. You're like, oh, good. I'm glad you asked. You know, let's fix that. You know, so
it's interesting at a meta level. I'm going to make a completely tangential kind of comment here, just based on something that I was just reading in a completely different field. I just read a book on the history of scurvy. So really left field here. But the interesting thing about that was, so back in the, you know, sort of 16th, 17th century and so on, you know, most of the people in the navies of the world, you know, Spanish Armada and French and English, you know, about 1% of the people who died during that time died in battle. 99% of them died of things like scurvy. They knew for decades how to fix scurvy, right? Vitamin C, that's all you need. You know, a little bit of lime juice, a little bit of lemon, whatever. But it took decades for that knowledge to permeate from kind of the grassroots knowledge of a few people who knew it, some of whom were, you know, were medical officers, or, you know, were passed for medical officers at the time on the ship, to the time that it made it up the chain to the, you know, the admiralty or whatever it is, and they could then start to sort of, you know, apply it. And of course, this was happening at a time where, you know, knowledge of you know, medical theory and all of those things was very nascent. But it rings a little bit true to me that we're still talking about, you know, the green, red, and, you know, people taking pictures of that like, oh my God, that's amazing, that's new. No, that's 15 years old. That it takes a while for, and I would suspect this is true in a lot of industries, and it's probably just sort of part of the human condition, for these really good, clever, simple, not necessarily easy to implement, but simple ideas to take root and really, you know, kind of help us out and make things better.
Well, you know, you know, just to do a plug for our last webinar, the 7 Deadly Diseases, it's just amazing when I go in and I talk to the edge. You know, I just talk to people, and, you know, the executives have these ideas that they, you know, I'll tell this one, just to hear another sidebar story, but it's very interesting. I was in one shop, and, you know, I meet different teams, and I do this like in their own natural habitat, right, where I try not to put them in like combined teams. I actually meet teams as they exist before the transformation happens. So dev team 1, dev team 2, Monday, you know, Tuesday, another dev team. And there was one shop where somebody said, we really loved last year's Agile. And I'm so busy writing stuff down. I'm like, you know, I'm going to leave that one alone right now. And then on Wednesday, another team said it again. I'm like, all right, I got to hear what this is. And what happened was, all these people on the edge, they thought Agile was the product. Like, so they were like, yeah, I think last year's Agile was something called Lean Kit, and this year it's Jira. And I was like, oh my God. So when I went back to the executives, and they were like, oh, you know, I can't believe that. We spent $1 million on training, and they should have known, and they did, but they didn't know, right? And again, I think your point about, like, you know, there were people that were probably dying or close to dying that probably knew scurvy, that there were some, you know, kind of blast radius remedies, right? But nobody went and talked to the edge, right? Again, you know, a lot of these times you talk to people at the edge, and they'll tell you, or you'll get a glaring picture of the disconnect. Like, you know, like when I find out, like, these teams of developers are like, hey, John, I'm embarrassed to ask, but we don't really know TDD here.
Yeah,
you know?
It's interesting that's sort of part of the anecdote there of, you know, the leadership kind of saying, oh, they should have. That's an interesting kind of cultural thing, and that resonates a little bit with my scurvy example too, just to push that analogy.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's why, you know, again, I'm not to harp too much. This is why I love this bottom-up approach, right? You know, not hearing what the, you know, top-down tells you, you know, the executive tell you this, and the next level tells you this. You just go right to the edge and let them tell you how things are.
I mean, they all assumed that scurvy, part of it was due to just being a poor moral character, because officers didn't suffer from it. Kind of ignoring the fact that officers ate pretty well,
yeah, that's right,
and had more access to better food. So anyway, we'll leave scurvy behind.
There you go.
And we'll go on to serverless, a whole other kind of thing. So, I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on, serverless. I think, the danger in our industry and probably a lot of industries is, we have terms. We need these secret decoder rings for what do these things mean. And for so long, especially in the beginning of these things, in the early days of these things, which I would say serverless were still, early, at least in a geological sense, it has different meanings for different people. And I'll talk to somebody one day where serverless just means cloud and VMs, and I don't run the servers, so I don't have physical servers, so I'm serverless. All the way to things like, well, this means I'm gonna rewrite my whole thing in Clojure, and it's gonna all be functions, and we're gonna use AWS Lambda for all of this, and it's going to be a completely different paradigm. And to me, those are all very different concerns and different things. So I'd love to hear your perspective on serverless. What is it? What isn't it? Where are we going with that? Again, very open-ended question.
Yeah. So for people, again, we could talk about the 8 ways of discussion about serverless, or we could just talk about the 2 that have all the oxygen right now, right? So one is Amazon Lambda, AWS Lambda, and the other now is just because it's part of Kubernetes is Knative, right? So again, there are some other platforms. In fact, most of the platforms, like the IBM platform and the other platforms are all committing to Knative, right? Or native, what I think it's again, we even argue about how to pronounce things, let alone that arguing about. But somebody it's native, it's not Knative. Tell him, in the comment section yelling, right? But so all right, those are the 2 boundaries then, right? Or the two primary things to focus on. And the problem is that like this whole conversation kind of started with Amazon Lambda. Lambda, from what I understand, was almost like a 3M sticky note accident, right? Somebody saw that there was one of the patterns for doing kind of transformations of kind of digital files, like could actually be used in a more expansive way. And so you have this kind of incredible growth because the model is really, really simple, right? And for those people that are hearing about, you shouldn't be hearing about this for the first time, but for anybody who's screaming, there are servers, yes, we know that. Like it's back to Anders, the abstraction. There's an abstraction that hides not only all the things about a data center, but hides even the notion of a VM or a compute instance, right? And just gets event driven. But what was interesting is when Google announced Knative, there was this little bubble up of this serverful versus serverless, and it was a way to differentiate Lambda from everybody else, right? And it's a valid differentiation in that what you have going on in Amazon is because of the nature of kind of the way you store functions, and then you drive them in kind of a, an event-driven structure. What happens is, and it really has made the complexity of writing an application that uses a lot of Amazon services very, reasonably simple. And so what has happened, I think probably this is something I'm sure Amazon didn't sit back and calculate this, but now there's a lot of horizontal movement of Amazon services now because serverless or AWS Lambda has made it much simpler, and even it makes more sense in that model, or in fact the only sense to drive a lot of these functions that you can from this kind of Lambda functionality. And then Knative comes out, and the first question is, yeah, that's great. You can run functions as a service, but where's all the serverfulness, right? Where are all the things? So I think there was a reasonable differentiation of, of what, we can call it serverless. We could call it functions as a service. And if you call functions as a service, then I think all of the above fit. But when you talk about Amazon Lambda, you got a different thing going on there than you have as Knative. And to be honest with you, Knative seems, I get it, but it seems kind of, I get that, they built in, but it's really running a container with a function defined in it with a really pared down operator. I mean, like I don't, I'm sure there's the Google people screaming right now, but I'm not crazy about the implementation of Knative, as it exists today. And I think I heard a quote that what we see for serverless right now will be like completely different in 5 or 7 years from now. So I think that's probably worth thinking through. So yeah, again, long-winded way of saying I don't think we have made it easy for anybody really to define serverless.
Yeah, I agree, and I think the other trap that we easily get into around this is, I'm serverless, so therefore I have zero responsibility for the operational quality of my applications. Whether that's the code quality, reliability, scalability, and all of those things, and all of a sudden this is completely not my problem. And all of a sudden I can divorce myself from all of those kinds of issues. And I think, people that go down that road are potentially in line for a pretty rude awakening when they figure out that you still need a little bit of operational excellence in order to run these things, whether they're serverless or not. It's just as easy, maybe even easier to write a crappy non-performing application in serverless as it is in server full.
Yeah, and you still have security vulnerabilities. And I mean, I think the thing is, I was at, it was about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago, I was doing a keynote at a serverless conference, right? And the whole debate of serverless versus DevOps. And some really smart people would come up to me that I really admire, would say, hey, John, do you really think you need DevOps? And I was like, all right, think of it this way. Like, when, General Motors are forward to building a car, and as they start going into kind of more autonomous opportunities in cars, maybe, I mean, I know this isn't happening now, but maybe at some point there'll be cars that won't have steering wheels. I know that's a long way off, but just go with my my narrative here, right? But when it happens, that just means that they're not going to completely change the assembly line, right? It just means at that point they won't put that piece in. And I think about that to your point about there's still operationalization, and there's still there are non-functional requirements of managing any service. And so, when you move from VMware, on-prem VMware, you have operational concerns of making sure VMware stays up, making sure the operating system's back, making sure the bare metal that you're using is good. When you go to cloud and you're running, maybe VMware in a cloud, which is, questionable, but all right, now you got rid of all the bare metal concerns, but you still got to worry about VMware being up, right? I think people get my point. When then you move to, EC2 instances, you don't have to worry about like the hypervisor anymore, but you do have to still worry about operating system patches. And as you keep moving further, you just keep removing some of the things. But at the end of the day, you have this responsibility as a service owner and a service provider, and I mean service in terms of the application that you're going to make money or put in front of a customer, to make sure that the things that make that malleable and consumable and to a customer and repeatably consumable to a customer, you have to do all those things. And some of them get easier, and in some cases, I think your point, they might get harder. There's some horror stories about hitting the boundaries. I've heard this, again, not blaming, it sounds like I'm blaming everything. I'm using Microsoft examples. I think they're all equal. I just know a customer that, that broke Azure functions really quick with a very large, it was a very large, commercial e-card for a very well-known brand that we all know. And they found scalable opportunities that have never been tested, right? And even almost architectural design problems. And again, this isn't just Microsoft, this could be any of them. So the point is, you can make a crappy, insecure application on any compute platform.
Exactly, and I think I love what Charity Majors has talked about and written about on this, and her blog on operational best practices for serverless is I think is brilliant, just in terms of, which basically, one of the things, to boil it down, is kind of like, there are trade-offs here, and you need to sort of worry about this, and nobody's ever going to worry about or care about your application or your service as much as you do, and you can't outsource caring. You can outsource labor, but you can't outsource caring. And you know, there are lots of new things that you need to learn and worry about in this, you know, kind of glorious new serverless world. And I think, you know, the other kind of sort of anecdotal thing that I've heard people talk about a little bit, including Charity Majors, is kind of, you know, is Lambda going to be the new stored procedures? And you know, stored procedures has a, I would say, a sketchy reputation in terms of, you know, they can certainly come in and save your day or save your life in terms of performance and those kinds of things. But then now you have a very opaque, you know, kind of piece of functionality that lives deep inside of one of the pieces of your infrastructure. And that's and it's not necessarily very portable to anywhere else if you decided to change that infrastructure. Well, I think there's all kinds of opportunities to shoot ourselves in the foot here, and, you know, tread carefully.
You know, I've been doing this. Well, I've been doing this, I guess, 40 years now, right? And I've seen, you know, I've seen whiplash in our industry many times. You know, when I started, you know, I'll be one of those old guys. I started on mainframes, but I did, and they were large monoliths, right? You ran basically for your whole business, you ran 3 servers, basically 3 mainframes, and basically one of them was like a backup to the other 2, right? So you really ran 2, and you crammed everything you had on those 2. And then, you know, in the 80s, there was this push for distributed computing, right? So, you know, some knucklehead companies started creating distributed mainframes. You want, like, out of all the things I've done, that's the one, like, would be the greatest, funniest chapter of all. But skipping that, then we went into client server, right? We went into a whole distributed world, and then you see this whiplash, you know, and then in a certain sense, you know, as we went back to, you know, kind of larger hypervisors or cloud structures, you know, you keep seeing this kind of bigger, smaller, bigger, or consolidation, expansion, consolidation. And so we're in this expansion you know, season right now, right? Where but I could easily see some convergent opportunity in our industry that nobody sees right now, that changes the game in such a way that there'll be a bunch of young kids scratching their head and saying, those idiots are running a billion pieces of code bumping into each other. Like, why don't they just use this XXX thing that consolidates them all and runs it more efficiently, right? Like, so there will be this question at some point. I'm not anti services or microservices or, you know, or function as a service. I think these are the right decisions today. But like you can see, in fact, I think our next topic actually will bring up and expose some of the opportunities of, you know, going, you know, I've got clients that tell me, you know, John, 3 years ago, I worried about a stack of 500 applications. Now I worry about a stack of like 75,000 applications because of microservices.
Yeah,
right?
So I'm going to skip us ahead to the next thing. You know, we've really already been talking about this. It's really the slides catching up to us a little bit, but, you know, containers, serverless, I mean, we've talked a lot about how, you know, a lot of serverless is just containers. You know, just is maybe a little bit of an unjustified way to put it, but you know, what would you say to somebody, you know, in terms of, you know, if they come to you and ask, hey, should I go learn everything there is to know about containers first and then serverless, or should I go learn everything there is to know about serverless first? You know, my take on that would be go figure out containers first, and then that'll be kind of a core thing that you can build on in a serverless capacity. What do you think about that?
I think you have to educate environments to think about a world for kind of greenfield or new opportunity, brownfield, which kind of strangle pattern opportunities, right? That you have to learn both. And I think that the secret sauce, you know, of the successful organizations will be sort of container first mindset, right? Like, think about clustered compute. I don't think that's changing. In fact, one of the things I do like about Knative is they're expanding on a kind of optionality of choice in a clustered compute environment. And what I mean by that is that, you know, when you're running your Kubernetes in Knative, you can literally run containers or kind of containerized functions. You know, they would just say they were Knative functions, right? And so I think that, like, getting your head around an organization of thinking about cloud native as a way to think about architecture, operationalizing on compute instances that are clustered, right? And then, you know, and so from an architectural design point, your primary focus then would be containers, so containerized, instantiation of this new clustered compute with the thought or the ability to kind of look ahead on, are there opportunities for certain workloads that will fit a function as a service environment? And so not all things are going to fit a function as a service environment, and there are some things that you probably shouldn't containerize and just skip the function. So again, if I'm making myself clear, which I'm overwinded and a blowhard, but I'll say, I think the right patterns for organizations to think about is everything's clustered compute for today, like go container first mindset, and then think about how do you pair off certain things that are very malleable to functions, and then you get to figure out where they live in Knative or Amazon Lambda.
I think that's a great way to put it. And while I talk, we'll flip to the kind of the next slide here, just as background. Again, slides are catching up a little bit to what we're talking about here. But I think if I were to up level that a little bit in terms of what you just said, it's look, these things are tools, and they're good for certain things and less good for others. And the more you understand about what they're good for and not so good for, now you can figure out how they apply to the problems that you're trying to solve. And just having, just sort of blindly, CIOs, and there are some out there who just sort of blindly mandate, oh, we're going to be serverless. So many of them don't really understand what it is that they're saying, unfortunately, or what the implications of that are. And they will certainly have lots of people who will then try to go off and try to implement that mandate, sometimes with great success, and oftentimes with great failure or great pain, at least. And so I think the idea here that you educate yourself on what these things are good for, educate yourself about kind of what the tools are to solve these kinds of problems. And especially educate yourself on persistence and how persistence plays into this, because the hard part
that becomes a really interesting. Again, I think you have to educate yourself on the concept of this new idea of clustered clustered compute, right? And so today it's sort of Kubernetes and containers, but just think about that, what does that paradigm look like for your application? And and there is a little bit of a catch-22 going on, for our customers, right? Which is that me as a service consultant person, you guys as a software vendor, but is that the catch-22 is that server full versus serverless, right? I think what Google is doing with Knative, and I got to throw out a shout out to my buddy's company Trigger Mesh, where they actually have a product now that they're spanning both Amazon Lambda and Knative. So, and they were announced at Google Next last week, which was pretty cool. But the thing is that it becomes, barring that, the problem or the opportunity confusion is that customers have to look at AWS Lambda and say, well, I've got all this stuff that I can glue into, all this horizontalized features of Amazon that I can do, and it just allows me to accelerate, particularly applications that are more malleable to these kind of environments, digital properties, or things that really fit well of like a function as a service application. And the second hand, I look at Knative, and that's a great long-term strategy, because you do have a very powerful and, even though immature in terms of commercial delivery, but certainly incredibly mature in terms of how Google's been running it internally, this system for running clustered compute, unlike, it's why Kubernetes has been incredibly successful, because, it is an incredibly well architected way to run clustered compute. So in one sense, again, here I go, and I start checking myself, am I making sense? But, in one sense, a customer say, well, the long-term strategy is, Knative and Kubernetes clusters for containers, and then I get Service Mesh, I get Istio Envoy, I get all this incredible operationalization that is growing really fast and built in, or I go with the pure horizontal Amazon functionality, but I don't see any discussion anytime soon about providing customers the type of operationalization that you get from Istio and Envoy and those type of things, and all the work that's going in there for Amazon Lambda, right? So that's a real, that's a how do you think about for the next 5 years, or how do you solve something for the next year and a half? And it's a hard decision.
It's very tricky. I think Is there anything left now that isn't at least somewhere by some vendor kind of software definable? I mean, networks have arrived as software definable, storage to some extent, at least the kind of the raw storage. What's left in terms of, X as code or X as service? What's left to kind of tackle there?
Well, I mean, here's the problem, right? Again, this is where I get cynical. I remember 4 years ago having a container debate with Chris. Oh my God, why am I forgetting his last name? This is my friend. It's getting old sucks. Chris Brown. Jesus, if he hears this, he's gonna punch me in the nose. He was the lead architect at Chef when I got there, but more importantly, he wrote EC2. And the thing was that we had this. It was at a conference. I was keynote 1, keynote 2, and it was a little bit gamified because it was early days of like Docker, and he wanted to point out some of the problems with containers, which is always legitimate. And I was trying to, what was the pros, and the middle ground between all this is composition, right? And Docker tried to come.
We may have lost your audio there a little bit, John. Well, I'll vamp for a second or two while hopefully we get you back.
Hopefully it'll be soon. I guess while we're waiting for John, I did want to remind the audience, even though we only have about 10 minutes left, but if you have a question for John or for Anders, please go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel, and hopefully John will make it back on. Are you back?
Yeah. When did I cut out?
Oh,
just
all right.
10 seconds, 15 seconds into what you were saying.
Yeah, I was just talking about like how we just seem to never get composition correct, right? And right now we have this wasteland of kind of YAML and Helm charts and all this stuff just spreading like a virus, as far as I'm concerned. And then there's some smart startups that are trying to build, DSLs around that to try to get better composition. But we have this kind of expansion effect that we lose sight. So I think the point I guess I was going to circle back to, I think it's going to get way worse before it gets better in terms of how do you compose all of this like expansion and ever fast moving infrastructure.
I like the way that you put that in terms of composition, because if you take composition and abstraction, those are really in some senses, I don't know if they're two sides of the same coin or how to sort of phrase that, but once you have abstraction, you can start to do really interesting high level, high value composition of these things. And that's where the way that you do these compositions becomes really important and quite powerful when they're done right. But it takes a while to figure out what done right really means.
Well, and again, it's a moving target, right? That's the whole point, right? Like, 4 years ago, like 5 years ago, you would have been laughed out of town for even mentioning YAML, like in the Chef and Puppet era, like YAML, my God, like how could you dare use YAML? Ansel, this is criminal. Maybe it was more than 5 years ago, right? And now we live in Rod Johnson wrote a defense of YAML article about 2 weeks ago, and he's the original founder of Spring, and like it wasn't really a defense of YAML. He was like I got nothing against YAML except when they're 4,000 lines of code and they have embedded scripts and they have header variables, throughout the whole thing. Like then I'm a little concerned, right?
Yeah, the problem I always have with declarative type approaches to these things, which are great. I'm not saying declarative is bad, but you can fall into the trap of, and I don't want to denigrate too much, but you can kind of fall into what I call the ant trap, which is the ant build tool for the Java ecosystem, which was still used in a lot of places and quite popular, but XML as a declarative way of doing things, which then very quickly became more of a procedural way of doing things. So you can have a for element in the XML.
Yeah, this is basically
at that point you're using a declarative thing to do something procedural, and it's ugly and hard to maintain. And what the hell is the point?
Yeah, this is basically what his article was about. But again, I think the point is that something like Docker Compose was a way to create a declarative abstraction to give you the ability to define network, compute, and storage. So if you had a 3-tiered application, you literally could define all those pieces in a YAML definition that was defined for simplicity to abstract incredible complexity, software defined, networking, all this stuff. But now we sit today with all of the kind of scalable growth of Kubernetes. We have this kind of nightmare of YAML going on, which is like it is not composition. It's like to your point, it's just grafted into procedural, and it like I see some of these Kubernetes implementations with Helm charts, and I'm like, oh my God, this is incredible technical debt.
It does, yeah, it does get a little crazy. So on our last slide here, before we hit Q&A, I want to talk a little bit about kind of, the 6 R's of cloud migration, which there are 5 or 6 depending on, who you talk to. But, one of the definitions is, rehost, replatform, repurchase, refactor, retain, retire. That's one take. Gartner's version is a little bit different. Rehost, replatform, revise, rebuild, replace. So I know I threw a lot of R's out there at you, but what do you think is the most important and most valuable thing for people to think about there in terms of, am I replatforming here? Should I refactor my existing application? Should I retire them and start fresh? And obviously, the answer is probably it depends, obviously, for anybody. But what are some of the guidelines that you give to people when they're starting to think about, should I strangle this thing into a microservice-based application, or should I start greenfield? How do you advise people?
Yeah, I think you have to point your compass, right? And first, right? And we covered this, right? Like I think the cloud native was architectural design. How do I think about? So I point my compass, right? So, and there are things we know won't change, right? There's still 60-year-old COBOL applications run on a mainframe that are system of record. That this, now. I'm not taking the Gartner by, their nonsense of, bimodal nonsense, but I'm just saying, like, you can DevOps those things and you can transform, you just don't rewrite them. But the point is, you set your compass, and the compass today, right, as we know it today, like you ask anybody who is reasonably in tune, me and you and a whole bunch of other people, I think most people would relatively agree that the compass needs to be set from an infrastructural way you're going to operationalize your new applications, migrate your old ones, and leave some of them alone, is this idea of clustered computing. And then your architectural design, the second, kind of that should align with the compass in the same direction, is really, for lack of a better 2 words, you start designing cloud native based applications. And I think you do those 2 things today, and you don't make them either or. You create your kind of your compass and your true norths to be directional, and not everything has to be there tomorrow. Some things will take forever. Some things, I don't know, may never get there. Some things may start tomorrow. So think of it not as a linear approach, but these are things that are going to happen in parallel. But everybody's pointing, in that same direction of, like, I need to get really good at understanding how to build next generation infrastructure around the principles of clustered compute, right? And then I need to get really, really good as an organization thinking about, how do I want to get everybody thinking about writing new applications or strangle, brownfield opportunities in a way that's consistent around that kind of operational model.
Awesome, that's great. So we've got a couple of minutes before the top of the hour, so let's see if we can squeeze in a couple of questions here.
Yeah. Okay, you're an optimist, I can tell. Okay, so I'll throw one at you. I think we'll only be able to get to one. How do you start on your way from VMs to containerization, and what steps would you recommend to get going?
Yeah, I think if I didn't make that answer relatively clear, then it's a big pound fail for me, which means you don't have to, like today, change your virtualization like VMware or whatever pattern. Just start containerizing the new applications, start running clustered compute, which you certainly can run on the VMware. Again, if the constraints of running VMware have some operational high cost or some, really, really low ROI manifestations, then certainly move to cloud. But if those things aren't looming, then back to what I was saying earlier, learn how to build and start creating clustered compute environments, and today I would say those would be containers and Kubernetes, and you can do that anywhere. That's the beauty of that paradigm.
Yep, I think that's great advice. Right. We'll stick with that.
Okay, perfect. Well, the great timing because we are at the top of the hour. If we didn't get to your question, I apologize. The folks at Electric Cloud will be getting a copy of all the questions though, so I'm sure somebody there will be able to follow up with you offline. Also, we want to remind the audience real quick that today's event has been recorded. So if you did not listen to the entire thing for whatever reason, or if you just want to listen to it again, you will have the opportunity. We'll be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And the webinar is also going to be on the devops.com website. So you can always check it out there. Just go to the webinar section and click on demand, and there it will be. Hey, John, Anders, thank you so much for a great presentation. As always, we appreciate it.
Thank you, Charlene.
Thank you very much.
All right. And thank you to the audience for joining me today. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon signing off. Have a great day, everybody.